Hello wrestling fans, Pro Wrestle Machine has returned. For whatever reason, 1997 was a very compelling year in the world's only real sport. Let's go. May 19, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter, Potential Raw Move, Time Warner drops MMA, WWE Cold Day in Hell pay-per-view, more. By Observer staff. The ever-changing Monday Night Wrestling Wars will begin yet another chapter in August with the USA Network moving the time slot of the WWF's Raw in War show. Due to network programming changes, which are not believed to be primarily due to any situations within pro wrestling, USA Network is moving La Femme Nikita to Sunday nights, and opening up its prime-time Monday night scheduled with reruns of the Chuck Norris Show, Walker Texas Ranger. This will result in Raw most likely being moved to a 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. time slot beginning on August 4th. Neither USA Network nor WWF would confirm this at press time as being official, although within the industry everyone believes this to be the most probable scenario. In theory, it would enable the show to get more risque with a later time slot. Although nobody has said as much, the belief seems to be that if the WWF was left to make the choice on its own, this wasn't a decision it would have made. At press time, the story is so fresh that there is no definite response from WCW or feeling one way or another on what will happen. The initial feelings we've heard is that WCW won't follow WWF and move 1 hour later because the feeling is the earlier time slot is superior because of the ability to draw more of a kids' audience both for television and to the live event, which would have to end at 11 p.m. or later for the live crowd if they were to present dark match main events on a school night. Eric Bischoff, at a meeting with the wrestlers on May 12, did hint at the idea of Nitro going 3 hours, although never expressed as they would do so to give WWF competition as much as because TBS wants a prime-time wrestling vehicle and due to the workload and costs. At this point, the idea of doing a second live show on another weeknight has been on hold. If Nitro expanded to 3 hours, the possibility would be that the third hour would be on TBS instead of TNT. That way TBS gets its live weekly prime-time wrestling show to boost ratings, and the added costs of running another live taping every week would be avoided. USA Today in its May 12 edition reported on the time change without even mentioning the Raw show, reporting it as the network struggling with its new shows on Mondays and Saturdays this season and is going to focus its promotion on its Sunday night lineup, which is why La Femme Nikita, one of the first run shows the network has pushed hard, is moving to Sundays starting on June 22. The NHB world suffered its latest in what seemed to be weekly political blows with the announcement that Time Warner Cable Systems will drop carrying its pay-per-view shows, believed to take effect after the May 30th UFC show, a blow so devastating to the genre that it caused the Extreme Fighting Championship to tap out for apparently the final time. As of this afternoon, my show's over, said EFC promoter and booker John Peretti to Valley Tudo News on May 7. We're finished. The powers that be have beaten us. EFC, which first went out of business on April 14, liquidating the company known as Battlecade Incorporated, got a new investor, believed to be Japanese, and reopened the company under the name Extreme Fighting and scheduled a pay-per-view show on August 15 in Davenport, Iowa. That show was canceled this past week. Many Time Warner systems, mainly in the Southeast, pulled the plug literally at the last minute on the most recent EFC show, even in systems that were still advertising the show even after the pullout. Semaphore Entertainment Group promoter David Isaacs said he believed Time Warner Systems would carry the May 30th UFC on a system-by-system decision basis. Other Time Warner systems decided not to pull the last EFC show because so much advertising had been out and there. Time Warner is the second largest cable operator in the United States, behind only TCI, which officially pulled out of carrying NHB events after the March 28th EFC show. Time Warner's decision came on the heels of National Cable Television Association President Decker Anstrom urging all the cable operators to pull out of carrying NHB shows in the May 5 Cable World Trade Journal. Anstrom said he felt it would be the politically correct thing to do because Congress, which is contemplating regulation of the cable industry, is putting pressure on the cable industry to curtail violent programming, and banning NHB events would politically look like the cable industry is taking a step in the right direction. At the same time, Semaphore Entertainment Group officials have been meeting with TCI about reversing its position. It is believed TCI will come to a decision yay or nay sometime this coming week. It is believed that Semaphore Entertainment Group has offered several rule alterations in UFC as a concession to get TCI to agree to carry future shows, perhaps even the next one, including making the wearing of gloves mandatory, position Isaacs admitted is more designed to make it look like sport to outsiders than one which would actually in reality minimize the brutality and injury risk. TCI expressed major concern, which led to the decision not to carry the events, which included Leo Hindery, who has been anti-UFC, coming on board as new company president, but also claimed the New York, and perhaps Hawaii law, could be interpreted as banning the events to be able to be aired. In Hawaii, there is no interpretation, as a television and pay-per-view ban is specifically spelled out, and they didn't want to be on the wrong side of the law. They wanted Semaphore Entertainment Group to present the event to where it looked more like sport and less like a spectacle, and because Americans think of boxing as sporting, the gloves were a compromise offered in that vein. The thought process seems to be that if the industry leader, TCI, reverses its position, that Time Warner would likely follow suit, leaving only Cablevision, the seventh largest cable operator, as the lone major not carrying the programming. In addition, a reversal of positions may stop what has basically been a domino effect of systems looking into and officially dropping NHB shows. As of press time, the events are no longer available throughout Canada, which was the strongest market for UFC in its heyday, and in 35 to 40% of the American pay-per-view universe. With EFC officially folding and releasing all its fighters from their contracts, Semaphore Entertainment Group signed EFC heavyweight champion Maurice Smith on May 13. Smith is expected to be introduced on the May 30th UFC show, possibly in the role of color commentator, to build up a July 27th pay-per-view champion versus champion match against UFC champion Mark Coleman. Exactly how Smith's EFC championship will be addressed on the UFC broadcast is unknown at press time, but it is believed his EFC championship and WKA heavyweight kickboxing championship would both be acknowledged on the next broadcast. Negotiations to hold that show at the Yokohama Arena in Japan, as a co-promotion with the Samurai 24-hour fighting cable channel, appear to have fallen through for many reasons. Among them is that Smith is under contract to rings in Japan and thus wouldn't be able to appear on a UFC show taking place in Japan, and the inability to put together a show that would mean something both in Japan and the United States. The Japanese promoters, H2O Promotions out of Nagoya, were wanting a Don Fry vs Genichiro Tenryu match, and UFC officials didn't like that pairing because of the risk of Tenryu, 47, getting seriously injured in such a match. The Japanese promoters wanted to use pro wrestlers Koji Kayao and Koki Kitahara as well for their name value because they were close to the war group, and UFC didn't want that close a connection to pro wrestling, and thought such a show would lack interest in the United States, which is still where the promotion has to draw from. The Japanese promoters didn't want Yoshiki Takahashi because of his affiliation with Pancrase, even though a Takahashi vs Jerry Bullander match seems to be a natural from a booking standpoint stemming from the February 7th pay-per-view show. There were also numerous technical problems with producing a show in Japan for broadcast in the United States that needed to be worked out, but time was running out on getting it done with enough time to properly put together the show. There is still talk of holding a show in Japan later in 1997. Whether the WWF's Cold Day in Hell pay-per-view was going to be a good or a bad show was far less important than the bigger question the show would begin to answer. Does Ken Shamrock have any potential as an American-style pro wrestler by World Wrestling Federation standards? Based on his first major match, the semi-main event on the May 11th pay-per-view show from the Richmond, Virginia Coliseum, the answer seems to be strongly in the affirmative. After both men worked much of the past week in Calgary under the tutelage of Bret Hart, Shamrock and Vader put together a match reminiscent of Vader's classic Japanese matches with Nobuhiko Takada, but with a little concession to American style thrown in. They did an exceedingly stiff and more of a semi-shoot than most people would realize in what was very close to a UWF style before fans who didn't quite understand the meaning of a lot of what they were seeing. And because Takada is one of the great workers and pro wrestling athletes of our generation, and it is totally unfair to believe Shamrock, with his limited pro wrestling experience, could walk into a new field and already be the level of performer as the elite members of that profession. But it was a good match. Better than anyone had the right to expect. Far better than many people undoubtedly going in would have feared. In comparison to other celebrity athletes from other sports such as Lawrence Taylor, Reggie White or Steve McMichael, Shamrock had an advantage. He was trained originally to be a pro wrestler by the likes of the late Buzz Sawyer and Nelson Royal. He did work for a few months in late 1989 and early 1990 on a small indie promotion in the Carolinas and Vincent Torelli, the Italian Stallion, even forming an occasional tag team with Ricky Steamboat, in a promotion which included the likes of the Nasty Boys, Robert Fuller, and Dean Malenko. He did one tour of All Japan Pro Wrestling under the name Ken Shamrock, where, in his own words, because of lack of experience, he was totally lost. He wound up hooking up with Malenko and trained in submissions, not by traditional martial arts teachers, but with pro wrestlers like the Malenkos and Karl Gotch. He ended up being booked with the Universal Wrestling Federation, a work-shoot-style group in Japan with the likes of Akira Maeda, Takada, Masakatsu Funaki, Minoru Suzuki, and Yoshiaki Fujiwara, under the name Wayne Shamrock, because Ken Shamrock had done a pro wrestling tour for all Japan and the promotion didn't want him to be confused with another traditional-style pro wrestler. That promotion folded just as Shamrock was getting started, and he moved to Pro Wrestling Fujiwara Gumi in 1991. By 1993, he was a legitimate major wrestling star in Japan, and he, Funaki, and Suzuki left PWFG to form Pancrase, taking a major career risk since he had already made a name for himself as a star since Pancrase was designed to largely be a shoot sport, the closest thing to legitimate sport that the pro wrestling world had seen in generations. Just as Pancrase was getting started, so was Ultimate Fighting in the United States. Shamrock was in the initial UFC pay-per-view show in November of 1993, beating Patrick Smith in the first round, but being choked out by Royce Gracie in the second round. He eventually became the top star in Pancrase and its first world champion, winning a tournament in late 1994, giving it up to Minoru Suzuki in 1995 as a business loss, before having a much publicized falling out with the promotion in 1996 over a contract dispute. He became one of the major stars of UFC after going to a 36-minute draw in a rematch with Gracie, and no doubt its highest paid performer, but fell short of being the dominant superstar that, due to his look and charisma, that the company hoped he would turn out to be. When Semaphore Entertainment Group failed to pick up his option on his contract, he looked back at pro wrestling as a new livelihood, but this time pro wrestling of the more traditional sense. It came down to New Japan and the World Wrestling Federation. What could have beens are just that, but it was the WWF that wanted him more and got him. So they had another highly paid non-pro wrestler on their roster with apparently no idea whatsoever what to do with him. But is not Chapter 2 of the Mark Henry story. The most obvious, and most lucrative, angle, the outsider angle that New Japan would have almost surely done to perfection, was blown in an immediate quest to get him on television for ratings purposes, a mistake in hindsight since there were no ratings to be gotten initially. After a few weeks of being put on television well before he or they were ready with a long-term storyline to build, the buzz was out that this was yet another in the long list of recent WWF booking failures. But after a few well-produced video features and Shamrock himself becoming more comfortable with his position and doing live interviews good enough for pro wrestling while not compromising his character into a cartoon, there was no question the potential was there to be a star if he could project being a star in the ring. Vader was both the best and worst opponent for a first encounter. The best, because of his own famous series of matches with Takada and experience at a work-shoot style, to draw from a knowledge of how to not compromise the shooter mystique of his opponent, but at the same time make it entertaining pro wrestling. The worst because it was way too soon for this match to take place. Vader should be the ultimate challenge for Shamrock months after blitzing every prelim wrestler in sight in record time. At that point, his finally being put in a position of jeopardy and his selling much of the match and coming out of the down predicament and coming out with a decisive win would have meant 10 times as much. But you can only play the hand that is dealt to you. When ring announcer Howard Finkel announced that the next match would be the no-holds-barred match, the response from the nearly full house of 9,381, 7,681 paying $116,547, the largest pro wrestling gate, although far from the largest wrestling crowd ever in the city. Along with another $55,000 in merchandise sales, was rather tepid. It was hardly the fever pitch one remembers in years past when a well-promoted stipulation would bring a huge crowd buzz just as Finkel said a few words and the crowd registered which match was coming up. But when Shamrock came down the aisle, he got a good response, the best thus far of the show. The crowd didn't take to him as a main event superstar, but they did see him as a star. The match itself was, as mentioned before, largely based on the three-match Takada-Vader series of 1993 to 1995. But the most important thing wasn't the moves, but how Shamrock came across. His selling was far better than expected. The crowd got with him to actually a surprising degree when he was down. His offense was believable, actually far more believable than all of the far more experienced wrestlers who worked the undercard on the same show. If you consider his experience level, he actually came across in the ring as a Japanese natural, one of those wrestlers that comes along every few years who in their first few matches you can already see are going to make it to the top. His style is still more suited for Japan, which in a sense is good because it breaks him from the rest of the pack and makes him unique, but bad because it requires a lot more work from the announcers to teach the crowd to register things they've never been taught before, such as stiff forearms and Muay Thai-style leg kicks. But this was also another example of Vader as the single greatest performer of his size in the history of this industry. Exactly how good Shamrock really is at this point and really can be as an American worker may not have been fairly indicated because of who he was in the ring with. A decade ago, there was a strongman gymnast, acrobatic, actor, bodybuilder who was trained in Calgary by the name of Tom McGee. He was 6'5", looks of a model, physique of an ultimate warrior, one of the strongest men alive, and could do cartwheels and backflips in the ring. In those days where size and physique ruled, here was a guy who was nearly as big as Hulk Hogan and 10 times the athlete. He had world champion written all over him. That was until he was put in the ring. One night in Rochester, New York at a WWF television taping, he had a dark match with a solid prelim wrestler who was experienced at getting good matches out of total stiffs. McGee was so impressive in that match that it became almost preordained, after the guy's very first WWF match, that he was the next Hulk Hogan, the heir to the throne. Of course, Tom McGee never made it in pro wrestling. He had no charisma, and he couldn't translate his athletic gifts into making a match. He never had another match 1/10 as good as the match he had in Rochester. About 5 years later, the wrestling world had changed once again. The guy put on the throne was the solid prelim wrestler, Bret Hart. The moral of the story is you can only take first impressions for what they are. First impressions. Cold Day in Hell was just another Sunday afternoon pay-per-view show that will largely be forgotten by the end of the week. Shamrock Vader and the main event, Undertaker vs. Steve Austin, were good matches. The undercard was as lackluster as ever. The show generally lacked heat. The finishes were clean. The outside interference was kept to a minimum so that the one point it was used for storyline, Brian Pillman ringing the bell to Steve Austin couldn't pin Undertaker, added to the show rather than resulted in the feeling of just another screw job. But it's more and more clear that the WWF is a company that has one tremendous feud on top, and even that one is getting overexposed, and very little depth otherwise. And the undercard performers who should have decent matches on paper somehow seem to get worse by the month. This hasn't been confirmed, but I believe neither Vince McMahon nor Jim Cornette attended the show due to personal situations. On the broadcast which Jim Ross did with Jerry Lawler, they said that Rose Anderson, a close family friend that McMahon's kids would refer to as Aunt Rose, had passed away the previous night, and Cornette's girlfriend came down with what they at first thought was appendicitis, although it turned out to be something less serious. Rockabilly, Monty Sop, pinned Jesse James, Brian James in 3:36 with a DDT in the free-for-all match. James' entrance music was messed up. It seemed like it was an angle, although nothing came of it. For such a short match, it was slow-paced with no heat. Finish was cool. Dud. 1. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, pinned Flash Funk, Charles Skaggs, in 10:05. This was a major disappointment. Funk's offense was way off, both in cutting down on the acrobatics and in what he did generally looking bad. Helmsley showed no aptitude in being able to carry someone. The Funkettes weren't there with the reason given that they were intimidated by China. Ross mentioned Funk's background of being trained in the New Japan dojo. Funk did a clothesline off the middle rope to the floor. While on the floor, China clotheslined Funk from behind. The match had no heat except for pops for China's interference and was a slow-paced match. Finish saw Funk go up top for a moonsault, but Helmsley split his legs. Helmsley climbed up for a backward superplex but flipped Funk all the way over in the move, then hit the pedigree for the pin. After the match, China picked Funk up and crotched him on the top ropes. Funk was said to be less than thrilled not only by his jobber position but for having to do the last spot, putting China over. 1 star. 2. Mankind, Michael Foley, beat Rocky Maivia, Dwayne Johnson, in 8:46. Mankind hit a rolling body block off the apron to the floor. The two brawled on the ramp with Maivia giving him a urinage suplex on the ramp. Another match with no heat. After a shoulderbreaker, Maivia signaled to the crowd for his finisher and there was little reaction and some booing. He went up for the flying body press, but Mankind reversed the move, rolling with it, and winding up with the mandible claw for the submission. Good finish. During the match they almost played down Maivia's unsuccessful reign as IC champion, with Jim Ross saying that the night Maivia beat Helmsley that the better man didn't win on that night. 1¼ stars. 3. Next up was the Ahmed Johnson-Tony Norris trilogy. It was announced on Raw that they would have the 3 matches at 3 different times during the show. During the pregame show, Farouk Ron Simmons said that he was hurt, which he was, that Savio Vega, Juan Rivera, was hurt, which he wasn't, and that Crush, Brian Adams, had the flu, which he didn't, and wanted all the matches in a row. Johnson agreed, providing Farouk wrestle first. For whatever reason, Farouk didn't go first, but the matches were in a row, which makes me think some communication signals were crossed before the show. Crush was first, and Gorilla Monsoon ordered the rest of the Nation of Domination to leave ringside. Crush several times signaled for the Nation of Domination to hit the ring and interfere, but they never did, seemingly again building a tease for a potential turn. Crush went for the heart punch, but Johnson blocked it and hit a reverse heel kick for the pin in 5:38. This was better than previous Johnson-Crush matches have been, but that's faint praise to be sure. Johnson beat Vega via DQ in 5:57. Vega came out selling his ankle, then jumped around to make everyone realize it was a ruse. He dominated the match and destroyed Johnson with chair shots to leave him easy pickings for Farouk. There wasn't much to that segment. Johnson and Farouk went 2:10. It was also better than you'd think considering who was involved. Johnson didn't sell for long and got a good near fall with an inside cradle. He hit the spinebuster and Pearl River plunge, but Farouk kicked out of the plunge to the crowd's amazement. Farouk then hit a chop block and scored the pin with the Dominator. 3/4 star. 4. Ken Shamrock beat Vader via submission with an ankle lock in 13:21 in what was billed as a no-holds-barred match. There must have been some sort of a late booking change, as the graphic and Howard Finkel's ring announcement talked about standing 8 counts, similar to the dramatic UWFI knockdowns that both would be familiar with, but Jim Ross then said that rule had been changed. Shamrock got a pretty big pop coming out. As the early action went to the ropes, Ross tried to explain the difference in that a UFC has no ropes. Ross was very positive in his explanations of UFC and said he enjoyed the shows, while Jerry Lawler seemed to be getting mad. Both worked and otherwise, as many veteran wrestlers who don't react when life goes on do when something changes the business they are in. The match was very good in that it was realistic enough to be suspenseful in a sport way. It still had enough pro wrestling maneuvers to not look like a UFC match. Vader rolled out of the ring several times early as Shamrock got the early edge. Shamrock hit a suplex and went for a knee bar, but Vader rolled out. Vader took control with stiff clotheslines and took Shamrock down with a Wakigatami. Shamrock used a triangle choke, Sankakujim, but Vader lifted him up and threw him. Vader suplexed Shamrock over the top rope to the floor, with Shamrock selling his knee as if it was injured on the landing. Vader ran him a few times into the ring steps. Vader ended up with a bloody nose. Vader went for a standing ankle lock, but Shamrock rolled out of it. Vader went for a choke on the ground, but again Shamrock escaped. Vader missed a moonsault, actually it grazed Shamrock. Shamrock body slammed Vader and went for both an ankle lock and a half crab, but Vader made the ropes both times. Shamrock threw a lot of hard knees and forearms into the corners, similar to a Misawa or Kawada type offense, and every bit as stiff. Vader cut him off with a solid shot to the head, and as he went down to capitalize on it, Shamrock maneuvered him into an ankle lock for the tap-out victory. This wasn't the kind of a match that you could do every night, which explains why the UWFI and rings guys generally only work one match per month. 3¼ stars. 5. Undertaker Mark Calloway pinned Steve Austin, Steve Williams, in 2006 to retain the WWF title. The Hart Foundation and Brian Pillman, who is associated with the group but not a member, came to ringside and had 5 seats set up, with a storyline that they bought the tickets from scalpers. Lawler was hilarious in comments regarding them. When Austin attacked Owen Hart, Lawler was screaming about how the wrestlers were attacking the fans. Later, when they were all sitting there calmly, Lawler said that it shows all the WWF fans don't misbehave. At the end, when in the post-match they all attacked Undertaker, Lawler said it was like after a soccer game that the fans were attacking the players. Match started slow and the fans didn't boo either one and really didn't know how to react. It was a good match, but not on the level of most WWF pay-per-view main events with Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels involved. Austin wrapped Taker's knee on the post, but Undertaker ended up smacking Austin's face into the post. Undertaker did his rope walk, but Austin swept his legs, causing him to crotch himself. Austin went for a superplex, but Undertaker threw him off. Undertaker missed an elbow. Undertaker used a sleeper, but Austin used a jawbreaker. The two traded low blows. Actually, the biggest pop of the match was Austin flipping off the ref. Undertaker used a choke slam, but Austin came back snapping Undertaker's neck on the ropes and hitting the Stone Cold Stunner. Brian Pillman hopped the rail and rang the bell, causing momentary confusion. When the match restarted, Undertaker went for the tombstone, Austin reversed it, but Undertaker reversed it again and dropped Austin on his head for the pin. After the match, Jim Neidhart, Owen Hart, Davey Boy Smith and Pillman attacked Undertaker. Austin saw Bret by himself in the wheelchair and knocked him off the wheelchair and grabbed one of his crutches and hit the ring and cleaned house with it. After the heels were run off, Austin jumped Undertaker and hit the Stone Cold Stunner, flipped him off and left him laying. 3 stars. In the only dark match, Road Warriors beat Owen Hart and Smith via DQ in a WWF Tag Team title match. This was described as a 5-minute dud match with all 4 going through the motions. Joan Weston, roller derby biggest woman superstar during that sport's second heyday in the 1960s and early 70s, passed away on May 10 at her home in Hayward, California at the age of 62. We had received numerous phone calls and letters regarding Weston after the mention of her illness 2 weeks ago in The Observer coming from an area television news segment on her condition. At the time, she had deteriorated from the rare Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease that eats away at the brain, leaving it like a sponge. She was unaware of her surroundings, had lost 60 pounds and looked to be 100 years old. It was expected at the time that the disease would kill her in a matter of months, but the end came quickly, and in that way, more humanely. "It's best that this was over, because this was just a horrible thing," said her husband, former roller derby star Nick Scopus in an interview in the San Jose Mercury. "All you can do is sit and watch this thing happen." The first signs of her mental deterioration were in a roller derby reunion game at the San Francisco Cow Palace last fall, where she forgot some of her trademark plays, although she tore the house down at the game and actually did very well for her age. About a month later, she began complaining that she was forgetting names and orders in the vehicle transportation business she and her husband operated. She was first diagnosed as having severe depression, then Alzheimer's, because her disease was so rare, hers being the first case of it ever in California. Known professionally as the Golden Girl, Joanie Weston, she was, along with tennis player Billie Jean King and ice skater Peggy Fleming, one of the 3 most famous female athletes in the United States during the late 60s due to the Derby's national television exposure. Even so, like a wrestling star of that era, she received little in the way of mainstream media exposure. Without question, she was the most popular female athlete of her time. The roller derby world she existed in was very much a pro wrestling on wheels, a worked violent pseudo-sport known to outsiders for its brawling, much of which was contrived, and loved by its fans for its speed and technique. In those days, roller derby and pro wrestling had tremendous crossover appeal, often booked back-to-back on television stations. Weston, at 5'9" and 160 pounds in a game filled with people who were in general much smaller than average size but very agile, was also nicknamed the Blonde Amazon. As the women's captain of the perennial home team in that era, the San Francisco Bay Bombers, she was the top women babyface in a world of babyfaces and heels, known in the Derby as home team and visiting team style. Derby, which had a major popularity peak from 1949 to 1954 when it was a huge sport based in New York, drawing huge ratings in prime time 3 nights per week on network television, had its second life based out of San Francisco just as television syndication of sports was getting off the ground in the early and mid-1960s. During its heyday, there were 2 major books written about roller derby, 5 Strides on the Bank Track, written by Frank Defford, and A Very Simple Game written by Herb Mitchelson. Each had a chapter on Weston. She also appeared in an acclaimed movie documentary called Derby. In the late 60s and early 70s, Sports Illustrated actually covered the Derby playoffs, held every September in Northern California. At her death, area newspapers called Weston during her one of America's greatest athletes of the 50s and 60s, a moniker that she was never bestowed with during her prime or her lifetime. In its heyday, the Derby had strong national television syndication which generally outrated every sport it would go head-to-head with in most markets except football, and played to packed houses on a countrywide winter tour that was very reminiscent of the type of promotions that WWF and WCW do today. Throughout the summer it taped a weekly television show for syndication, broadcast live on Sunday afternoons in San Francisco out of Keyser Pavilion in Golden Gate Park, and was a shockingly strong draw in Northern California. The Bay Bombers were always the home team, playing against villainous foes with Weston's main rivals being the likes of Ann Calvello with her before her time Dennis Rodman hair coloring Jan Vallow, Margie Laszlo, and Sandy Dunn. In the 60s, behind the promotion acumen of Jerry Seltzer and star power of Charlie O'Connell, The Bombers used to regularly outdraw the Oakland A's when both would play Friday or Saturday night dates in the same Oakland Coliseum and Arena Complex head-to-head, including a traditional Stadium July 4th date that sometimes drew in excess of 30,000 fans. Weston was the game's biggest star with the exception of O'Connell, from the mid-60s through 1971, although nobody made much money, with Weston's best years being in the $25,000 per year range. Although most Derby fans have memories of Weston's heyday with the Bombers lasting seemingly for decades, it was actually from 1965, when she joined the Bombers and replaced the retiring Annis Big Red Jensen as the top woman skater, through 1971 when the Bombers were broken up as the Derby attempted a failed national expansion and she joined the Chicago Pioneers as their top drawing card. After several winters of drawing sellouts in most of the major arenas around the country for one-night stands, the Derby had an alternate competing promotion called Roller Games based in Los Angeles and Philadelphia during the same time frame. Owner Seltzer, whose father Leo invented roller derby in 1935, put into motion a plan to turn derby into a real league with more than one home team and pushed it nationally as the sport of the 70s, combining the speed of hockey and the contact of football. What turned out to be its fatal business decision of expanding from its San Francisco base and attempting to turn it into almost like a real sports league with home teams in different cities, with new home teams including the New York Chiefs out of Madison Square Garden, the Chicago Pioneers out of the amphitheater, where a young Chet Kopic got his first break as a television sports announcer, the Jolters out of Cincinnati, and the Bombers being sold to an independent ownership group in Texas. The latter two barely got off the ground, but the New York and Chicago teams were initially big successes. Both were still eventually done within 2 years, which skaters blamed on a combination of the gas crisis of 1973 and Seltzer going through a messy divorce and getting out of the derby business, leaving Bill Griffiths and Roller Games with the entire country. Weston was made top star of the Pioneers during that 2-year period, which included one interpromotional game against the Roller Games Los Angeles Thunderbirds at Comiskey Park in Chicago in 1972 that drew the Derby's all-time record sellout of 50,118 fans, and skated in a playoff game that same year at Shea Stadium in New York that drew more than 25,000, but few remember her as anything other than number 38 on the Bombers. By the end of 1973, those factors and an inability keep audiences coming back to the same arenas on a regular basis as opposed to once or twice per year outside of the San Francisco home base, the Derby folded as Seltzer sold out to Griffiths. The quick demise of Derby as a top arena draw and television ratings phenomenon to extinction is a constant lesson to its sister world of pro wrestling of just how quickly audiences' tastes can change. Its alter ego, the Roller Games, a more theatrical version, which Weston joined and became a member of the Thunderbirds after the Derby folded, had a few more months of success through 1974 before largely falling apart due to the same problems that killed the Derby, leaving Weston with a lot of bitter memories and a long-time feud with Griffiths, and a behind-the-scenes decade-plus-long feud between the Game skaters based in Southern California and the Derby skaters in Northern California. Over the next 2 decades there were numerous attempts at revivals both in the Bay Area and the Northeast, but almost all were short-lived and none came anywhere close to approaching the game's former exposure and popularity. Weston worked in most of the revival attempts in the Bay Area, bought herself a bank track, trained skaters for her sport that had really ceased to exist, and trained dogs. Her death was a traumatic blow to the entire roller derby community because she was the game's remaining icon, the link to the glory days who the younger skaters, particularly the women, saw as a superstar and role model among them. Even during her heyday, Weston was always considered almost like the den mother to the younger skaters. O'Connell, a loner, had walked away in the early 80s when he couldn't perform at the top level anymore and realized it wasn't coming back, and never looked back. Over the weekend, many of the skaters and the followers who pay collectors' prices for rare copies of old programs, videotapes and merchandise, and have continued to support insider newsletters for a sport that really hasn't existed in any real form for nearly 2 decades, were finally forced to come to grips with what had been obvious to everyone else for years. Not only had Joan Weston died over the weekend, but that the roller derby she was the living representation of is also dead. Despite the high hopes of many and constant talk of new investors reinventing it, that it really isn't coming back. According to legend, Weston likely would have been a top athlete in any sport she had chosen. In the early 50s, women's sports really weren't the option they are today. She grew up in Huntington Beach, California and was a phenom from her teenage years, skating her first professional derby game just 3 days after her and her best friend Annette Taglialauer, who became something of a star herself using the stage name Tony Tag, attending their first training class, an unprecedented feat then or since. She made 19 consecutive All-Star teams, which even though the games themselves were worked, the All-Star teams were picked as shoots, from 1955 through the folding of Derby in 1973. But perhaps the biggest testament to her popularity was in a game in the late 60s. Years before the famous Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs Battle of the Sexes, there was a derby angle leading to Joan and Weston's match race with Bob Woodbury, the leading male heel. Unlike a pro wrestling angle or a television sitcom, where the woman babyface would actually beat the befuddled egotistical man, Derby tried to work its games and angles like they were a shoot sport, almost a UWF version of wrestling. When they had the big promotion, it was worked like it would be in reality, with the larger, stronger Woodbury giving Weston a horrible beating, which resulted in one of the biggest sports riots ever in the Bay Area and the skaters being unable to leave the track that night until 1:30 a.m. because fans' tempers were so out of control. Weston, who married Scopus in 1985, had no children of her own, but had 2 stepdaughters and 4 step-grandchildren. Her funeral services were scheduled for May 14th in Hayward. Television rundown. April 26, New Japan. This show replayed the Jushin Liger vs. Great Sasuke match and post-match angle, Masahiro Chono vs. Great Muta and Antonio Inoki vs. King Tiger matches from the Tokyo Dome show. The only new match that aired saw Shiro Koshinaka pin Takashi Ishikawa with a butt bump off the top rope in a 1 3/4 stars match. It also showed just how well the Chris Benoit vs. Kevin Sullivan match with the women at ringside got over in Japan when they replayed so many matches from that show to fill up the past 2 weeks of television and never aired that one at all. May 3, New Japan. 1. Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi beat Keiji Muto and Osamu Nishimura in 14:05 when Nakanishi made Nishimura submit to the torture rack. The crowd was dead throughout this show, which hurt all of the matches. The last 6 minutes of the bout aired on television. The crowd was pretty well dead for Nishimura and only reacted to Nakanishi's trademark spots. Muto and Kojima did better toward the finish. 2.5 stars. 2. Liger and El Samurai and Norio Oniga beat Koji Kanemoto and Shinjiro Otani and Tatsuhiro Takaiwa in 16:40. The last 7 minutes aired. This was a notch below what you'd expect from these guys, but still a very good match. Crowd took away from the match. Takaiwa, who is showing a lot of improvement of late, got a nice pop when he caught Samurai, who was going for the Frankensteiner, and dropped him into 2 consecutive power bombs. Lots of good near falls toward the finish, ending with Samurai pinning Kanemoto after what appeared to be a reverse DDT, but Samurai got him off the ground in a new maneuver which they called a reverse brainbuster. 3.5 stars. 3. Tadao Yasuda beat Michiyoshi Ohara in 10:57 with a Boston Crab. The last 3:30 aired. Again, crowd was dead. Work was okay, obviously nothing memorable. 1 star. 4. Riki Choshu and Kazuo Yamazaki beat Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito in 9:55. This had a weird finish. Tenzan came off the top rope with a diving headbutt on Choshu, who not only didn't sell it, but popped right up from it, and when Tenzan turned around, lariated him for the pin. Really goofy finish. Up at that point the match was better than average. 2 stars. 5. Shiro Koshinaka and Tatsutoshi Goto and Akitoshi Saito beat Junji Hirata and Tatsumi Fujinami and Kensuke Sasaki in 10:19. Not exactly a memorable television main event. Goto was terrible. Everyone else was in the okay range. It's scary when Sasaki is the hottest worker in a 6-man tag. The last few minutes were pretty good, though, ending with Koshinaka pinning Hirata with a power bomb. Even though the 6-man with the juniors was a very good match and none of the matches were bad, this was one of the weakest New Japan television shows of the year because it was a series of matches that really didn't mean anything. Nothing special happened and the crowd made the matches seem worse than they really were. 2.25 stars. Puerto Rico. Nothing much new on the Invader #1 Trompetilla angle, although Trompetilla challenged Invader to appear on his television show on May 6. Huracan Castillo, Jesus Daniel Castillo, was fired by WWC. There was a disagreement between himself and owner Carlos Colon as Castillo would come to the shows and bring about 15 friends with him, and the other wrestlers complained to Colon that they wanted to bring all their friends. Colon told Castillo he was setting a bad example for the rest of the boys and could only bring his family to the matches free, and Castillo got hot and the argument reached the point where Colon eventually fired him. Castillo held the Puerto Rican title and on television they announced that Ray Gonzalez was the new champion. Not sure if the belt changed hands in the ring or it was a phantom change, probably the latter. Announced as coming to WWC with the fabulous Freebirds, said to be Michael Hayes and Terry Gordy, although I seriously doubt Hayes showed up. First off, WWF seems to be aligned with WWA in Puerto Rico and not WWC. since Savio Vega books and runs WWA. Second, many of the dates Hayes was booked coincided with dates he was working as an announcer for WWF as Doak Hendricks. Abdullah the Butcher and the Headhunters were also set to return. Ram Man Johnny Evans turned babyface on May 1st in Las Marias. He was in a tag match with Chicky Star against Colon and Gonzalez. 3 times as Ram Man was getting pinned, Star tried to make the save, but all 3 times Gonzalez moved and Star would kick Ram Man. The two ended up fighting after the match ending when Victor, the bodyguard of Star, hit Ram Man with a chair and he juiced. Lineups over this past weekend were May 10th in Caguas with Colon vs. Abdullah, Invader and Gonzalez vs. Jim Steele, who is leaving for an All-Japan tour after this past weekend, and Mohammed Hussein, Lou Fabiano, Ricky Santana and Lale defending WWC tag titles against Freebirds, Ram Man vs. Victor, Headhunters vs. Brett Sanders and Justin St. John, Pablo Marquez vs. Rico Suave and Alex G defends the lightweight title against Chuck Singer. Mother's Day special on May 11th in Cabo Rojo had Colon defending the Universal strap against Star, and the rest of the undercard was the same as Caguas. EMLL. The May 9th show at Arena Coliseo drew a packed house of 5,500 for a family. It is the brother combinations of Dr. Wagner Jr. and Silver King faced Negro Casas and Felino, starting a feud between the two families. In the cheap finish, Wagner pulled off his own mask behind the ref's back and threw it at Felino, who caught it and had it in his hand when Silver King turned the ref around and called for the DQ. Headhunters returned on that show, teaming with Gran Marcus Jr. to beat Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Ultimo Dragon and Mascara Magica. Promo Azteca. The May 16th show in Tijuana will be headlined by Rey Mysterio and Rey Mysterio Jr. teaming up for the first time in a few years, due to being on opposite sides of a promotional feud, against El Hijo del Santo and Misterioso to continue the build toward the eventual Mysterio Jr. vs. Misterioso mask match. There will also be a 16-man tournament underneath. The main feud is Cien Caras vs. Mascara Sagrada right now, with Caras using the tombstone on Sagrada, who went out in an ambulance on the May 9th card. On the May 2nd show, they met for Sagrada's IWC heavyweight title, and Cien was about to use the tombstone when his brother, Mascara Año 2000, ran into the ring and the ref turned around and saw Mascara in the ring and disqualified Cien, enabling Sagrada to retain the title. They also restarted the lengthy family feud with Villanos vs. Dynamitas as V3 and V5 teamed with Andy Barrow, with V4 at Universal for WCW, against Mascara Año 2000 and Universo 2000, and Shu El Guerrero with the Dynamitas DQ'd when they destroyed V3, including unmasking him and bloodying him up. AAA. Jake Roberts no-showed his last 2 bookings in Veracruz and Nezahualcóyotl and was replaced by Fuerza Guerrera and the Sangre Chicana respectively. In the case of a Roberts no-show in AAA, based on history you don't know if it's AAA's disorganization or Roberts' track record. The wrestler Scarecrow used to wrestle as Cajos in EMLL, and Schizophrenia used to wrestle in EMLL as Ultimatum. Veracruz on May 7th was a major show with some incomprehensible booking. In the opener, Mini Vader and Mini Mankind and Mini Goldust beat Mascara Sagrada Jr. and New Octagonchito and Super Muñequito. In this one, Mini Goldust, who turned face when Mini Mankind and Mini Vader and Mexican Paul, Mini Paul Bearer, all turned on him a few weeks ago, was back as a heel with no storyline explanation and teasing no tension. In the main event, it was Diesel and Razor Ramon and Guerrera, replacing Roberts, against Cibernetico and Connect and Latin Lover. Cibernetico had just turned heel on Connect, but in this match they teamed up, never teased any tension and seemed to simply forget about the turn as the announcers never brought it up either. I guess when you can't explain it, the best thing to do is ignore it. Pentagon retained the Mexican middleweight title, beating Octagon when Sangre Chicana did a run-in and gave Octagon a low blow. They announced on television that Tinieblas Jr. and Pero Aguayo Jr. would both be returning shortly from back and groin injuries. All Japan. They announced the next tour from May 18th to June 6th, with a foreign crew being Steve Williams, Johnny Ace, The Patriot, The Lacrosse, Jim Steele, Gary Albright, Giant Kimalatu, Sabu, Rob Van Dam, Bobby Duncombe Jr., and Richard Slinger. The only match announced for Budokan Hall on June 6th is the Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Toshiaki Kawada Triple Crown title match. The second biggest show of the tour will be May 27th in Sapporo, with Kawada and Akira Tao defending the double tag team titles against Kenta Kobashi and Ace, plus Misawa vs. Jun Akiyama, Williams and Lacrosse vs. Albright and Patriot, Giant Baba and Daisuke Ikeda vs Tomoe Honda and Satoru Asako and Sabu and Van Dam vs Kentaro Shigai and Yoshinari Ogawa. May 18th the tour opens at Korakuen Hall with Tao and Kawada and Takao Mori vs Kobashi and Ace and Patriot, Misawa and Akiyama vs Williams and Lacrosse and Kimala 2 and Honda vs Albright and Duncombe Jr. Van Dam challenges Ogawa for the PWF Junior title on May 21st in Tokushima. Sabu wrestles Van Dam in a singles match on May 24th at Korakuen Hall, and Akiyama and Omori defend the All-Asian Tag Team titles against Masao Inoue and Honda on May 31st in Sendai, which also has Kawada vs Patriot and Tao vs Ace singles matches, and there is a Misawa and Akiyama vs Patriot and Kobashi Tag Team match on June 4th in Takasaka. This is expected to be Patriot's final tour with All Japan, and he'll be starting with WWF in June or July, likely under another name. April 27th television show did a 2.9 rating, while the May 4th show did an incredible 5.8 rating. Not even sure what was on the May 4th show, but assume it was an Albright and Stan Hansen and Omori vs Williams and Ace and Johnny Smith match, which makes that number even more inexplicable. It would be the best rating All Japan has done in a few years and probably better than a 50 share in that time slot. New Japan. Antonio Inoki, Satoru Sayama, Kazuyuki Fujita and Naoya Ogawa are all scheduled to come to Slamboree this week. Ogawa has never seen American wrestling live, and they wanted him to understand it. Don't know if it'll even be acknowledged on the WCW broadcast. There is talk about trying to put together a deal with rings for a match for the August 10th Nagoya Dome with Ogawa vs David Kakalishvili. The Russian, who is the current world heavyweight champion in Samba, having won a tournament in Japan late last year, was the 1992 gold medalist in judo in Barcelona, beating Ogawa in the gold medal match, so this is a natural sports rivalry. I don't believe Keiji Muto will be coming to the show after all, since New Japan will have started its tour by then. Jushin Liger and El Samurai will face Shinjiro Otani and Yoshihiro Tajiri on the Big Japan show on June 7th at Yokohama Bunka Gym. April 26th television show did a 3.2 rating despite being mostly reruns from the Tokyo Dome, while the May 3rd show did a 1.8 rating with mostly dead matches. Other Japan notes. The Hickson Gracie vs Nobuhiko Takada match appears in jeopardy. Nippon TV, the same network that broadcasts All Japan, was one of the main sponsors of the proposed August 15th Tokyo Dome show, but pulled out because of the costs involved, particularly the large guarantees that both Gracie and Takada were promised to get the match to happen. The idea of the show was to present an entire card of pro wrestlers versus Valley Tudo shoot matches with the wrestlers from Battle Arts, Kingdom and Rings involved, although politically getting Rings involved wouldn't have been easy. Hoist, Elio and Horian Gracie were in Japan this past week and held a press conference on May 6. Hoist, 30, who hasn't fought since his 1995 draw with Ken Shamrock, claimed he was in negotiations with 2 Japanese offices but didn't specify which ones, and said that he wanted to fight in Japan, said he was interested in competing in a UFC-style tournament, and issued a challenge to Mike Tyson. Naoya Ogawa's name was brought up and Gracie praised him and said he'd be interested in fighting him as well. The lone major show was an All-Japan women's card on May 11th in Nagoya before 4,750 fans. The main event saw Kyoko Inoue defend the Triple Crown, going to a 60-minute draw with Kaoru Ito. After the match, Inoue returned her title belt, saying that a true world champion should pin her challenger and that she considers a draw to be a loss. AJW will be presenting big shows back-to-back on June 17th and June 18th in Sapporo, so this may have been an angle to set up a 2-night tournament for the belt. In the other top matches on the show, Manami Toyota and Toshio Yamada, one of the all-time legendary women's tag teams, reunited to win a non-title match over current WWA tag champs Tomoko Watanabe and Kumiko Maikawa when Toyota pinned Maikawa in 1848, no doubt setting up a tag title match for Sapporo. Soon-to-be-retired Bison Kimura and Asia Kong reformed their early 90s tag team of the Jungle Jacks for one night, beating Takako Inoue and Yumiko Hata in 23-12. Atsushi Onita returned from his meeting with Vince McMahon, Bruce Pritchard and Jim Ross and talked about wanting to do an explosive match on a WWF pay-per-view show. He said that Mr. Ganasuke and Wing Kanemura would be wrestling in the WWF, and that McMahon had asked him to help promote a WWF tour in not only Japan but also in Asia. FMW's ideas appear to be along these lines: run a big show on its own in September, then come back in November with a show using Michinoku Pro, WWF, ECW and Pancrase. At this point neither WWF nor Pancrase have agreed to the show. That show wouldn't have interpromotional matches and each group would run its own matches, but it would wind up in angles where FMW would first feud with ECW then run a larger show feuding with WWF. FMW ran Korakuen Hall on May 8 before a sellout 2,100 with Onita wrestling using his Great Nita gimmick, showing up unannounced as the mystery partner of Kanemura and Haido against Hiramichi Fuyuki and Geto and Jado. Nita broke a beer bottle on the post and dug it into Fuyuki, Geto and Jado's foreheads to cut all of them and used a large knife on Fuyuki's forehead and ripped his mouth with the knife, used a barbed wire baseball bat and blew the kabuki miss 5 times during the match. Onita will wrestle on May 25 in Hakata teaming with Masato Tanaka and Tetsuhiro Kuroda against Kanemura and Haido and Hideki Hasaka. War continued its tour through the final night on May 10 around a Genichiro Tenryu vs Abdullah the Butcher feud. War announced a major show for July 6 at Sumo Hall, which may be headlined by a Tenryu vs Butcher singles match. Pancrase announced its complete lineup for May 24 in Kobe as Minoru Suzuki vs Joel Sutton 2-0 in UFC alternate matches, Yuki Kondo in a non-title match against Gary Myers, a former NIA All-American wrestler in the early 80s who has fought in a lot of NHB matches in the United States including on 2 EFC pay-per-view shows, Jason DeLucia vs Yoshiki Takahashi, Semishot vs Takaku Fuke, Kyuma Kunyoku vs Keiichiro Yamamiya and Takafumi Ito vs Kim Jong-wan. JWP had announced suddenly that Tomoko Candy Akutsu, 22, would be retiring on its May 10 Korakuen Hall show due to rib injuries. However, at the show, Akutsu said that she would be retiring on August 17. The Korakuen show drew 1,500 with Devil Masami and Hikari Fukuoka retaining the JWP tag titles beating Cutie Suzuki and Plum Marco on top. Ricardo Moraes and Adilson Lima from Brazil are booked for rings on June 21 at Ariake Coliseum and shoot matches. Caught the April 22 ring show from Osaka and it was a great show. Only Tony Halme vs Dick Frey and Akira Maeda vs Fulcon were obvious works. It was pretty clear most of the other bouts were shoots. I'd suspect Kiyoshi Tamura vs Tsuyoshi Kosaka wasn't a shoot, although you couldn't tell from watching it as they worked the match not to have the dramatic spots that they do in their worked shoot matches nor the near submissions and near knockout spots. Just another example of just how good Tamura really is. Halme, who weighed 288, looked really slow and it appeared that Frey could have taken him apart although it was at work, but he was wide open too often. Frey kicked him in the face and shut his eye on the first kick as an accident and the finish didn't look like a planned finish but Frey was taking it so easy on him it was clearly a worked match. Maeda vs Han was a good match. Maeda needs to get in a lot better shape and being out of shape looks bad in a shoot-style match, however his work is much better now because he's given up on the kicks which in recent years have gotten so slow he looks bad, and concentrated on the submission and at work where he still can look impressive. USWA No House show again this week in Memphis. A correction from last week. Queenie isn't managing Brackus and Spellbinder, however King Reginald did fire her on last week's television show. Lance Russell was apparently not at television this week and they explained it by doing an angle where Dutch Mantle came out to do the announcing and they claimed Russell was there but wouldn't do the show unless Mantle left, which he didn't. Bill Dundee already turned backface arguing with Mantle about saying Mantle was embarrassing himself. The two ended up going at it with Michael St. John pulling them apart. Flash Flanagan must have gotten the guitar from Billy Travis in an angle, but Travis hit the ring during a Flanagan squash and gotten it back and hit Flanagan with it. King Reginald had a match against Mr. Wrestling, Carl Fergie, with Wrestling winning with a small package. Lanny Keane is now called Bloody Ox Brody. Steve Boz is gone. They aired a clip of a Jerry Lawler vs. Mantle match from 1982 which apparently is going to build up a new feud. Mantle used a dropkick in that match and Lawler commented it was probably the last dropkick Mantle ever threw. They have a newcomer named Scott Rains, who looks somewhat like Jim Neidhart. Brian Pillman was in Carruthers, Mississippi for a casino show sometime this past week doing a run-in breaking a trophy over the head of Paul Diamond. A television match with Brackus and Spellbinder vs. Diamond and Dunn ended when the Truth Commission attacked both teams which appears to be leading to triangle matches. Here and there. George Steele is booked for Jim Kettner on July 19 in Wilmington, Delaware and for Dennis Coraluzzo on July 20 in Yardville, New Jersey in his first matches in many years. Jim Hellwig is apparently booked for Ultimate Championship Wrestling on May 24 in Deer Park, New York against Chris Chavez, Tatanka, which would be his first match since leaving the WWF summer. Kind of strange since the building only holds about 800 people. UCW usually draws about 200 per show, and you figure Hellwig's price demands are exorbitant. Rick Martel is going back for a summertime tour full-time for Emile Dupree in the Maritime provinces of Canada starting in late June, working as a tag team with Don Casablancas. Iron Sheik and Leilani Kai appear on June 28 in Martinsburg, West Virginia for Championship Pro Wrestling. Frank Iadivia's Jersey All Pro Wrestling has its next show on June 22 in Hackettstown, New Jersey. Iadivia is billing himself as the serial killer who called Howard Stern for help. Next All Pro Wrestling show in Hayward, California is May 31 at the Pacific Coast Sports Gym. Demon Hellstorm of the Sunshine Wrestling Federation tore his pec and underwent surgery which could be career-threatening. NHB. The Friends episode on May 8 had one of the storylines around Courtney Cox's character's boyfriend fighting in UFC and showed a brief clip of a UFC with the Octagon, ring announcer Bruce My Brother is Famous Buffer, ref John McCarthy and Tank Abbott. Abbott actually did what looked like a pro wrestling stampede move on the guy. Chemo was on The Daily Show on Comedy Central. It was apparently taped after his recent match with Brian Johnston as his face was messed up. The hosts were making fun of his religion, especially since Chemo acquitted himself so well not knowing much about the Bible when passages were brought to his attention. There was an NHB tournament held in Luzhniki, Russia on April 30, which included former UFC performers Cal Worsham and Joe Charles, both of whom lost in the first round, was won by Roberto Travan of Brazil, who won an alternate fight at the September 1996 UFC in Augusta, Georgia, and then wouldn't come out for the finals against Mark Coleman due to a hand injury. Vitor Belfort is said to now weigh 220 pounds. Tom Erickson's management team are trying hard to get him into UFC, but UFC seems to want to push Coleman for the time being as its heavyweight wrestler and sees Erickson, who could likely beat just about anyone, as lacking charisma. UFC is attempting to get Dan Gable to come to the next pay-per-view since he's got a long-standing association with Hoyce Alger. Alger was Gable's assistant coach at Iowa the past few seasons and wrestled for Gable when he was an NCAA champion. ECW had what was reported as a pretty hot show on May 10 at the ECW Arena before an estimated 1,100 fans. Shane Douglas and Bam Bam Bigelow beat Pit Bulls in the opener. During the match, Rick Rude hit the ring and carried Francine off to the back. Axel Rutten beat Chris Chetty. During the match, Chetty did a Takamichi Noku-like double springboard moonsault. Tracy Smothers and Little Guido faced Spike Dudley and Mikey Whipwreck, who as it turned out never got the reconstructive knee surgery. They did an angle where Smothers dropped Whipwreck's knee on the guardrail and he was carted out and Balls Mahoney replaced him, but the FBI still wound up winning. Joey Styles then opened the television taping and introduced Rick Rude. Rude is doing a gimmick where his whole announcing repertoire consists of double entendres, and in that vein, he's really hilarious. It's the kind of thing that would probably get old after a while, but that's a moot point since it's just a short-term idea to begin with. Anyway, Rude said that he'd been hungry, but that you can get anything you want at Francine's restaurant, and talked about the Black Angus and the Red Snapper. PG-13 debuted and talked about being friends with Jerry Lawler and how they used to beat the Eliminators up for $40 per night in the USWA. This led to a tag title match which Eliminators won with the total elimination on Wolfie. After the match, JCI said that they respected the Eliminators but that the war wasn't over. Unfortunately for this angle, because of what happened on Raw with PG-13 against the Legion of Doom, where it was not only a job but a joke of a job, it's made it very difficult for Heyman to push PG-13 as anything other than guys to put his teams over rather than a long run with Eliminators. Too bad, because apparently PG-13 were either, depending on the viewpoint, a breath of fresh air in ECW because they were good workers who knew how to get heat, or disappointing workers because they didn't do nearly as much Japanese-style high spots with Eliminators and fans expected. Tommy Dreamer beat Louis Spicolli in a double juice match, but after the match, Spicolli gave Beulah the Death Valley driver. Terry Funk came to the ring to check on Beulah, but Dreamer pushed him out of the way. They are teasing tension between the two, but don't expect an angle out of it. Big Dick and Devon Dudley beat Gangstas when Bubba interfered, but after the match, New Jack came off the top rope onto Bubba Ray Dudley's bad ankle. They did a spot where two sets of two tables were stacked on each other while Mustafa and Big Dick were on the top of the stage, and both went off together through two tables. Told the spot was stupid because both got up from the bump within 90 seconds, and by the time they were back in the ring, neither was even selling the spot. Sign Guy Dudley was with the Dudleys. Taz and Chris Condito again beat Sabu and Rob Van Dam in a good match when Condito pinned Van Dam with a German suplex. After the match, Paul Heyman and Van Dam were yelling and screaming at each other over the house mic to build an angle to set up Van Dam being at Raw. Finale was a four-way match with Sandman, Raven, Stevie Richards and Terry Funk that went something like 25 minutes. Richards and the BWO officially broke up. Richards, working with a broken nose from the May 2nd show, supposedly had his career-best match being the last one left with Funk and them going a long time before Funk pinned him to keep the title. Fans were cheering for Richards to win the title. Got conflicting stories on Richards. One, from Heyman, is that Richards had signed a letter of intent to negotiate, thus was basically under a binding agreement, when it was reported here as such, and that he has since signed a contract. The other is Richards did sign the letter of intent, which runs out in a few weeks, and has been offered a contract but has yet to sign it, although he doesn't have any outside offers, and this shouldn't be meant to start rumors he's going anywhere. Several wrestlers have been offered contracts, but the holdup in at least a few cases is that the contracts, which call for a minimum per show guarantee, have a 6-month non-compete clause after the contract expires. WJAR, the NBC affiliate in Providence, Rhode Island, ran a 2-part series on ECW which was very negative, largely based around the Eric Kulas incident from November. Kulas or his lawyer insisted that he had never told Paul Heyman he was 19 nor said he was trained by Killer Kowalski as Heyman had claimed. Heyman was ambushed by the reporters after the most recent Massachusetts tour and only said this was a matter for the attorneys to settle. No lawsuit has been filed in the case, but the news story hinted that one was on the way of being filed, and the Kulas family attorney was quoted on the show, which included clips of the incident itself and some pretty damning clips of New Jack doing an interview talking about his violent past. There was apparently some local reaction of complaints from ECW fans. Official crowd for May 3rd in Trenton, New Jersey was 950. May 8th in Queens, New York drew a sellout of 925 with Funk over Raven, who had won a 3-way dance over Richards and Sandman earlier, in 4 minutes, and Taz and Condito over Sabu and Van Dam in 10 minutes as the top 2 matches. Crowd was really hot for this show. May 9th in Downingtown, Pennsylvania drew 500 for somewhat of a dead show. WCW. The main topic of Eric Bischoff's speech to the wrestlers before Nitro on May 12 was that Kevin Sullivan was taking a hiatus as booker of 4 to 8 weeks due to burnout and all the pressure of the job and outside personal pressures as well. Bischoff emphasized Sullivan wasn't being replaced, although naturally that denial started all kinds of rumors that he was, and that he wanted him to come back fresh, and was very adamant about how all the backstage dissension stories being public in the sheets are hurting the company. They should worry about the backstage dissension and Booker's plans constantly being ignored, winding up in angles not making sense before worrying about people reporting on it to a microcosm of the audience. But this is the wrestling industry we're talking about. Sullivan is taking a leave of absence, so he isn't expected to be around for a while as a wrestler either, which also puts the Jacqueline angle on hold. The Jacqueline angle in Palmetto, Florida last week wasn't taped. It was just done to gauge crowd reaction to it, which was said to be strong, but it was scheduled to eventually take place and lead to Sullivan putting Jacqueline over in a match. On the Saturday TBS show, Sullivan did a bizarre interview talking about having a shoot in the bar with Benoit, the angle on the Boys from New Orleans in January that nobody in the general public would have a clue about, and Meng talked English and said he broke the nerve hold on Benoit because Nancy said so, because Nancy was still family. Sullivan started the Jacqueline turn by saying she forgot where she came from and that he's the man, and told her not to come to Slamboree. They've given her a new wig and are dressing her to look softer and more feminine for her babyface turn. Chris Benoit's scheduled house show matches against Sullivan have been changed to Meng. In Baltimore, the dark match main event was supposed to be Benoit versus Sullivan in a death match, but no announcement was made in the building regarding the match, and neither Benoit or Sullivan appeared on the entire show. Bischoff, J.J. Dillon and Terry Taylor will be handling the booking temporarily. The May 12 Nitro drew 8,058, paying $132,068 to the Baltimore Arena. Aside from the opening match, it was a flat show. Randy Savage was out with no crutches, challenging Diamond Dallas Page, who was said to be injured in last week's angle, although he appeared in a dark match in front of the live crowd. Ultimo Dragon beat Juventud Guerrera in a TV title match in 5:14 with the Dragon Sleeper, in a very good match that blew away anything on either Monday night show. Ric Flair, Roddy Piper and Kevin Green did an interview, and then Scott Hall, Kevin Nash and Syxx were on the video wall running them down. Last week Piper requested having the card changed to him against Syxx in a singles match, which would have Flair and Green versus Hall and Nash, and since Piper has creative control of his programs, it was at least under consideration. It's going to be the Syxx man, as they've changed the main event storyline in a way to appease Piper. Dean Malenko kept the U.S. belt, beating Steve McMichael in 3:15. After a lame ref bump, Reggie White hit the ring and splashed McMichael, leading to Malenko making the pin. McMichael looked really bad here and White looked worse. Fans popped big for White's interview anyway. Wrath, Brian Clark aka Atom Bomb, beat Scotty Riggs in 1:02 with a urinage suplex. He came across as just another large, faceless, interchangeable, uncharismatic Brian Lee Ties, but the announcers worked hard at getting his size over. Fans had a small Atom Bomb chant at him, but it didn't last long. Conan and Hugh Morris beat Ice Train and Alex Wright in 3:19 when Conan made Train submit to a half crab. Train was so lost the match completely fell apart. Wright didn't do much wrestling, but was a hoot in doing his heel turn tease with the disco dancing and bragging about women wanting his body. They did an angle where Hall, Nash and Six attacked Piper's artificial hip, presumably with a chair. The angle just showed them running away and Piper writhing in agony. Eric Bischoff said he was going to interview Sting, but instead interviewed Imposter Sting. The real Sting came out and dropped Imposter Sting with a scorpion death drop and Bischoff ran away. They had spent the entire show building up that Sting would be doing an interview, and the air went out of that segment when Imposter came out, and it was so deflated that even the real Sting couldn't breathe life into the angle. After the show went off the air, Meng beat Ric Fuller in a bad match, Mortis beat Super Calo, Rey Mysterio Jr. beat Psychosis in the best match on the card, Glacier beat Villano 4 and Giant, and Page beat Harlem Heat in a match with a lot of heat. Before the Mysterio Jr. match, a woman fan proposed to her boyfriend, who accepted. While WWF drew a larger audience once again on May 12, in many ways it was a victory for WCW. Nitro at 7 p.m. drew a 2.83 rating and 5.63 share. Raw drew a 3.20 rating, 2.95 first hour, 3.45 seconds hour, and 4.85 share. Raw had a strong 3.9 peak for the final Hart-Michaels confrontation. Raw lost soundly to the Knicks Heat NBA game on TNT, which drew a 4.0 rating and 6.4 share. Other weekend ratings saw main event at 1.1, Saturday night at 2.0, and Pro at another abysmal 1.1. At one point Kevin Green was asked to turn heel on Flair and Piper and join the NWO in Charlotte, but Green nixed that angle. The official injury to Lex Luger was a pulled abdominal oblique muscle, but he should be back in action next week. It looks like the major Hogan-Luger match will be on August 9th in Sturgis, South Dakota to headline Hog Wild, coming out of an angle bash at the beach, which will be Hogan and Dennis Rodman versus Luger and Giant. Hogan versus Luger will also take place in Boston as the June 9th Nitro, but not sure if that will be televised or not. June 28th in Los Angeles will be Hogan versus Sting, Hall and Nash versus Giant and Luger for the tag title, Savage versus Page, Benoit versus Meng, Six versus Mysterio Jr. for the Cruiserweight title, Steiners versus Harlem Heat, and Malenko versus Eddie Guerrero for the U.S. title. There will be a few other matches, including both Flair and Piper wrestling on the show. WCW now wants Raven to start at the Boston Nitro. On the April 19th TBS Saturday show, for some reason there was no commentary during an entire Jeff Jarrett versus Scotty Riggs match. People were saying it was the best announced match on Saturday in months. Here's this week's storyline on the women's title. It was announced on television that the title was in dispute because of a legal dispute in the match, which never took place, between Medusa and Akira Hokuto. Not only was Medusa when she showed up at Nitro last week unaware that she had won the title, but midweek in Japan when the news hit that Hokuto was no longer the champion. When the reporters asked Hokuto about it, she had no idea because nobody had clued her in on the angle either. At the May 5th Nitro, during the segment where Nash and Six began yelling at J.J. Dillon about no longer working for McMahon and Nash saying he owed Dillon one, Dillon had no idea that any of that was going to be said, which is likely why he came across looking so bad in that situation. No major news coming from the Universal tapings in Orlando, Florida. Reports were that Lizmark Jr. looked green, but he was never in a situation where he would look good. Black Warrior never showed up. Told that there were a lot of good matches, with people you'd expect against each other, in particular involving Mysterio Jr., Dragon, Guerrera, and Psychosis, but all lasted 5 minutes. The James boys did well as heels, doing kind of a Southern militia gimmick. They don't try to hide that they're the Armstrongs, since they come out to the same music the Armstrongs do and are announced from Marietta, Georgia. High Voltage is also showing improvement. Yuji Nagata looked okay being put over in squashes. Horace Boulder was in but looked good. Another new guy was Bill Goldberg, a former football player who was the really big bodybuilder-looking guy that wasn't picked in the Piper angle with John Tenta. Considering these were his first matches, he was said to have shown a lot of potential. There was some backstage heat between Booker T and Big Al. Al complains a lot about having to do nothing but jobs because he still remembers the pops he got in the ECW arena. June 6th in Buffalo for the Ilio DiPaolo show will be Hall and Nash vs. Luger and Giant, Page vs. Savage, Benoit vs. Meng, Steiners vs. Public Enemy, Mysterio Jr. vs. Guerrero, and Malenko vs. Eddie Guerrero, plus the old-timers matches with Dory Funk and Greg Valentine vs. Tony Parisi and Gino Brito, and one more match. Phil Mushnick in TV Guide reprised the same criticism of Reggie White for doing Slamboree that he had a few weeks earlier in the New York Post. TNT is producing an original TV movie called Assault on Devil's Island that will be produced in Miami starring Hogan, Carl Weathers and Shannon Tweed and will air in October. WCW has already reported on its own hotline that Conan would be breaking up with Hugh Morris and joining the NWO. While in Japan last week after the Osaka Dome show in a bar after many drinks had been emptied, Bischoff and New Japan referee Masao Tiger Hattori ended up betting each other a few $100s that Hattori couldn't take Bischoff down. Hattori, 51, 10 years older than Bischoff and probably 50 pounds lighter, was a great wrestler in the Chris Taylor/Dan Gable era. In 1970, while representing the New York Athletic Club, Hattori and Riki Choshu both wrestled for the New York AC before getting into Japanese pro wrestling, the United States AAU Greco-Roman champion at 136 pounds, and in 1971 placed 5th in the AAU Freestyle Championships at the same weight. Anyway, they cleared out the tables in the bar and Bischoff won the bet when Hattori couldn't take him down, which has to rank as a major upset. Curt Hennig is now expected to start with WCW in June. There are all sorts of legal claims on Hennig that have to be sorted out. Even though Hennig's WWF contract expires right around now, the WWF is claiming they still have him under contract, using the same logic Pancrase used for Ken Shamrock after the date on his contract expired. WWF claims WCW tampered with contracted personnel, and since Hennig no-showed a pay-per-view that the WWF booked him on, he was technically suspended, and they believe him being suspended means his contract doesn't expire until he comes back from the suspension and fulfills the remainder of the term of the contract. Without seeing the contract, WWF would have an argument if Hennig had agreed to perform a minimum of dates within the contract. That was the Pancrase position with Ken Shamrock, since it was a 9-show, 1-year contract, and their position was Shamrock hadn't done the 9 shows when the 1 year was over, and it's doubtful that was in the contract, but who knows. WCW is planning on using him in a few weeks anyway, no matter what WWF claims. WWF May 12 Raw tapings from Newark, Delaware before a sellout 4,077, paying $58,124 were largely lackluster. Bret Hart, and even to a lesser extent Steve Austin, appear to have run out of material due to overexposure. Austin's delivery is incredible, but his interviews are getting predictable. Hart's interviews, which had been the best in wrestling for most of this year, the last 2 weeks have been endless babbling about American scum that last too long and remind one of a more articulate Iron Sheik. At the beginning of the show, Hart promised a surprise. At the end of the show, he asked Shawn Michaels to come out and began insulting him, but went on way too long and the show went off the air before the climax of the angle, which was Michaels knocking Hart out of the wheelchair. After that, the Hart Foundation went to jump Michaels, but Austin made the save. Actually, aside from Rob Van Dam, there wasn't a bright spot on the show other than the crowd was rabid for a lot of the show. In a King of the Ring qualifier, Ahmed Johnson beat Hunter Hearst Helmsley via DQ when Chyna hit Johnson with a chair in 354. Match was brutal, and I don't mean violent. Johnson jumped Helmsley after the match and Chyna started choking Johnson until the agents pulled them apart. For King of the Ring, besides Undertaker vs. Farouk, Austin vs. Brian Pillman, Brett vs. Michaels, and Owen and Bulldog defending against Legion of Doom, they'll do the core tourney but only a Final Four, so Johnson is the first one in. Other first-round matches will be Vader, who missed the taping because he was legitimately banged up from the Shamrock match, versus Crush, Goldust versus Jerry Lawler, and Mankind versus Savio Vega, so one would assume that means a first round of Vader versus Johnson and Mankind versus Goldust. Scott Putski debuted. Jim Ross said Scott was in his early 20s and had just graduated from Texas Christian University. If my memory serves me, Putski's senior year at TCU was in 1984. They aired some clips of Ivan Putski, including a clip where he was beating up on Roddy Piper, I guess as retaliation for the Flair Vader clips on Nitro a few weeks back. Scott beat Leif Cassidy in 406 with a German suplex. Putski looked mechanical in the ring and not good, nor did he get over. After the match, Cassidy claimed that he had won. Legion of Doom, can you say rapid physique change in 1 week? Beat PG-13 in 159 after destroying both with double impacts. It was billed as two Nation of Domination members, and Crush and Farouk basically forced PG, playing chickens, into the ring. They didn't get any offense in but took good bumps. Mankind and Paul Bearer, face all wrapped up, did an interview with Bearer saying he was going to reveal something Undertaker doesn't want known unless Undertaker agrees to come back to him. Farouk did an interview about Undertaker trying to make it a racial deal, bringing up that there had never been a black WWF champ and said there had only been token IC and US champs, mentioning Ahmed Johnson and Bobo Brazil. Undertaker, whose knee is legitimately in bad shape right now, beat Vega via DQ in 3:56 when the entire Nation of Domination interfered and Farouk whipped Undertaker with a belt after the match. Van Dam pinned Jeff Hardy in 2:28 with a split-leg moonsault. Van Dam looked good in the squash as all his moves were right on, and he did a great pre-match interview with Jerry Lawler, agreeing with Lawler that all the ECW wrestlers were minor leaguers except himself, and called himself Mr. Monday Night. This angle was set up by Bruce Pritchard and Paul Heyman, who was at the show making sure it went right, so Heyman could have his own outsider heel in his own promotion and expect Van Dam to end up with Raven's heel position, although by that I don't mean as ECW champion, just as one of the top singles heels. Van Dam got more heat than most of the WWF undercard guys on the show, although it came from a vocal feud chanting "You sold out" at him. If that response isn't weird, selling out because they think he's joined the WWF. They did the second Goldust interview, which wasn't as good as the first and came off as even more desperation in trying to salvage his character. Undertaker did an interview saying that the Paul Bearer secret was best left unsaid. They did a four corners match with Owen and Bulldog, Headbangers, Doug Furnace and Phil LaFon, and Blackjacks, which was awful. Wyndham pinned LaFon in 1:42 with a lariat. Mosh pinned Bradshaw when LaFon interfered, tripping him during a commercial break. Smith pinned Thrasher in 10:19 with a power slam. Match had no heat at all, which isn't a good situation considering how hard Owen and Bulldog are being pushed. For Shotgun, Farouk and Jim Neidhart won a squash. Rocky Maivia beat Rockabilly via DQ and Leif Cassidy was given a win over Matt Hardy. Main event saw Undertaker beat Mankind in 1 minute in a dark match, and they did a six-man with LOD and Austin over Owen and Bulldog and Pillman as the show closer. Besides Raw, the weekend numbers saw Livewire at 1.2 and Superstars at 1.5. Shamrock will be replacing Sid on the road shows the next 2 weekends, including main eventing at Madison Square Garden and in Auburn Hills, Michigan. Sid had a cortisone block shot in his lower back on May 8th and is expected back in action on May 30th in San Jose. Leif Cassidy, Alan Sarvin, gave notice, but that was more an attempt to get the WWF to do something with him than a sign he's quitting. His contract is up at the end of July. They had talked with him about doing a gimmick as the world's greatest Mexican wrestler wearing a mask and spoofing Mexicans, but with the AAA deal falling apart, they never got it off the ground. Since he doesn't have a guaranteed contract and is only on the road as a fill-in, he isn't making all that much money, and you can imagine the frustration with not getting a push when far less talented wrestlers who aren't getting over have angles. At the same time, he's been a disappointment in the ring in his big matches. In regard to Mankind, while he hasn't signed a new contract, his old one isn't due until the fall, but he's begun negotiations for a new one, and it is generally believed he is looking to stay since his only real options are ECW and FMW, which don't pay nearly as well, as he's got a lawsuit out against WCW. Shawn Michaels is expected back in the ring on June 6. For whatever rumors there are about Dusty Rhodes going to WWF, and WWF did design the pieces with the expectations that those rumors would start, Rhodes has 1 year left on his WCW contract. Silver King may be headed in. Officially, Brian Pillman isn't supposed to be a member of the Hart Foundation but simply an affiliate. There was talk of Doug Furnace and Phil LaFon in similar roles, but that hasn't happened. Before Bret Hart did the gimmick about American fans not understanding and appreciating talent, Furnace and LaFon were going to do a similar gimmick. Officially, Rene Goulet, Bob Bedard, George Steele, Jim Myers, and Jay Strongbow, Joe Scarpa are still with the company as agents, although they aren't booked for any dates at present. Ring announcer Lance Wright for sure, and I believe Bill Dunn and Barry Horowitz were let go. The women were told that the Los Angeles gimmick was a bikini contest, even though it'll be advertised as a tanning contest. They held 2 regular house shows over the weekend. On May 9th in Hamilton, ONT they drew $7,681 and $141,464 Canadian, and May 10th in Scranton, Pennsylvania drew $2,961 and $52,555. They did Undertaker over Vader and non-title with Johnson and Austin over Bulldog and Owen in Hamilton. Phil LaFon missed the show as they've got some sort of a paperwork deal that wasn't cleared up, and LaFon hasn't been allowed to go back to Canada because he won't be able to get back in the US. So he spent midweek in Connecticut rather than going home to the family and wasn't allowed to go across the border to Hamilton for fear they couldn't get him back. Scranton, Maine had Austin and Johnson and Undertaker over Owen and Bulldog in Pillman. The third wrestler with Adam O'Brien and Ahmed Johnson in the May 5th Crush deal was an indie in the Midwest who goes by the ring name of Danny Dominion. Tito Santana ripped a blatant degree. ESPN's Keith Olbermann was recently on Comedy Central's Daily Show. When he was asked facetiously for the worst place he's ever worked, he snapped, Bristol, Connecticut, where ESPN is based. ESPN immediately suspended him. Backstabbing in the locker room is nothing new in pro wrestling. Undermining a dislike of his own spiel having nothing to do with storylines, badmouthing Sullivan in the process. Ric Flair becomes a loose cannon and tells Six, I've had more titles than you've had pieces of ass. Live broadcasts have become the meat and potatoes for pro wrestling, whether it's PPVs or Monday nights. But things are quickly getting out of hand as far as interviews go. It's one thing to give performers mic time to get over. It's another thing altogether to let them say whatever they want without restrictions. Kevin Nash, big salary and all, should have been suspended from television for a couple of weeks, and Doc Sal's time should have been curtailed on live television. Just who is in charge of this company? Somebody has to take control before one of the boys makes another comment like Hulk Hogan did about doing an OJ in case someone important is actually watching and pays attention. Not liking your boss or your spot is one thing. Being vocal about it is one thing. Airing your problems on a television show when almost none of the audience storyline. How about this as a solution? Anyone throwing out shoot comments on the air without prior permission jobs at the next pay-per-view show? That should put an end to this pettiness once and for all. Jeffrey Cohen. Bayside, New York. Joan, Weston. The main reason I subscribed was to try and get news about wrestling in Japan, mostly in Mexico, and I've been pleased with that. But I've also been impressed with the game. I also wanted to thank you for printing the news about Joan Weston. Most against the villainry of Bob Hine and Ann Calvello, though my loyalties were split when they faced Ronnie Robinson and a dark-haired lady whose name I've forgotten. It's part of the difficulty in growing old to learn of the passing of the heroes and heroines of your youth. I feel lucky that my memories of most of my childhood heroes aren't compromised by the knowledge of salary disputes and drug problems. My memories of Joan Weston will always be simple and pure, her flying around the track and throwing an elbow into Ann Calvello. Calvello goes screech way it was, once upon a time. I hope it can be that way for Joan for the rest of eternity. Bill Mills. Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Business. Like the presence and charisma of Hall and Nash. Hart still looks like the heel from the Karate Kid movies while Smith looks like the bully in the old Charles Atlas comic book ads. The past year has shown that nobody should discount the importance of color and personality in wrestling. Great workers like Chris Benoit and Steve Austin would have never gotten over if their personalities weren't allowed to shine as they have this past year. Does anyone even remember the Ringmaster? The WWF has created a better angle for its number 2 main event than for its world champion. Though Mankind is a great performer, he has not been sufficiently re-established as a main event heel. Take a listen to his unbearable commentary on Shotgun. The Goldust character has been destroyed. Even if they made his character overtly gay, he could have gotten over as a face if he was presented tougher. As for Helmsley, just imagine if Marcus Bagwell was put in the same role. And right before WCW introduces Curt Hennig, the WWF brings back Jim Neidhart. That says it all. Even the Bret Hart angle has its flaws. Why does he have to do lame anti-American interviews? The angle is beginning to look like a bad ripoff of both the Hogan NWO and the old Four Horsemen. This is not a blanket defense of WCW or Nitro. I'm also frustrated at the holes in their booking, and booking that is often ego-driven. However, too many readers cut the WWF too much slack because of one decent angle. And too many. Response from Dave Meltzer, both WWF and WCW are drawing fewer television viewers than at the same period last year. In the case of WWF, the numbers are way down. The comparisons were only for cable, and for WWF and WCW there is no misleading in the comparisons between this year and last year because you are comparing the exact same things other than WCW, which showed a slight decrease, should have been expected to have a slight increase since Nitro went to 2 hours. It didn't, which is another indication overall viewership has declined. WWF should also have had a slight increase over last year because Raw was switched time slots yet still drew on average better numbers. Adding in the Nitro, the overall number of viewers in a given weekend of WCW programming has increased over the 1990s. There were other wrestlers just as good and better than Thez. He was asked about his shoot with Bill Miller in Pittsburgh. He said every time he wrestled Miller they went at it pretty good, but that was just the way it was and that he had no ill feelings toward Miller.